The desert remembers everything, even the things we've forgotten. If you walk long enough across the empty plains of southern Iraq, where the rivers Tigris and Euphrates once ran wild and full, you'll find the ruins of the first cities ever built. Broken ziggurats rise from the sand like the ribs of a long-dead giant. Clay tablets lie buried beneath the dust, etched with stories older than the Bible, older than Egypt, older even than myth itself. And on those tablets, written in the looping symbols of the Sumerians, are words that whisper of beings who came from the sky. Beings who ruled like kings, taught like scholars, and vanished like ghosts. They called them the Anunnaki. The name means those who came down from the heavens. To the ancient people of Sumer, they weren't just gods. They were architects, judges, and teachers. The divine council who shaped the world and decided the fate of humankind. Their stories speak of creation and rebellion, of floods and forgotten wisdom, of gods who fought among themselves for power over earth. But behind those myths, behind the poetry of the past, there lingers a question. One that has haunted archaeologists, historians, and dreamers for more than a century. Who were they, really? Were the Anunnaki just symbolic, metaphors for natural forces and royal power? Or were they something else entirely? Memories of beings that once walked among us, misunderstood by time. The story begins more than 6,000 years ago in the ancient land of Sumer, in what is now modern-day Iraq. It was here that humanity took its first great leap, where writing, astronomy, mathematics, and law were born. The Sumerians looked to the stars for guidance, and what they saw there shaped everything they built below. To them, the heavens were not distant, they were home. The sky was a mirror of their world, and every city, Uruk, Eridu, had its celestial counterpart. Every temple was a bridge between the earth and the divine. And ruling above it all were the Anunnaki, the gods of both realms, said to descend from a faraway kingdom among the stars. Over time, their stories evolved, merging into Babylonian and Assyrian mythology, spreading through the ancient world like rivers of belief. They became the gods of rain and wind, of war and wisdom. Their names changed, their roles shifted, but the essence remained, that humankind was not alone and never had been. And then there's the detail that continues to fascinate, the one that doesn't quite fit within myth alone. According to Sumerian tablets, the Anunnaki didn't just rule from the heavens, they came here. They walked the earth, they created, taught, and judged. The texts describe their arrival, their technology, their hierarchy, and their departure. They left behind temples, laws, knowledge, and a single unanswered question. Why did they leave? For centuries, scholars dismissed these tales as myth, ancient metaphors for the natural world. But others, reading the same words, saw something different. Something too detailed, too literal, too consistent to ignore. They began to wonder, what if the Sumerians were telling us history, not legend? What if the Anunnaki were not gods at all, and even but visitors? It's a question that has given rise to one of the most controversial and captivating theories in modern history, the ancient astronaut theory, the idea that early gods were not divine but extraterrestrial, that the Sumerians' heaven was not a spiritual realm, but a planet, a home far beyond our sky. To some, it's pure fantasy. To others, it explains everything, from the sudden leap in human knowledge to the mysterious ruins scattered across the world. And somewhere between skepticism and wonder lies the truth, hidden, like everything else, beneath the sands of time. So tonight, we step quietly into that world again, to the cradle of civilization, where myth and memory still breathe the same air. We'll trace the rise of the first cities, the birth of writing, the gods who ruled them, and the whispers that still echo in the clay. Because whether the Anunnaki were real or not, their story is, and it has shaped the way we imagine gods, power, and the stars for more than 6,000 years. So settle in. Let the desert winds carry you back to the dawn of history, where the line between heaven and earth was still being drawn, and where, perhaps, the gods once walked among men. This is the beginning of the secret history of the Anunnaki. When the Sumerians wrote about the Anunnaki, they didn't describe gods as we imagine them, distant, glowing figures in the sky. Beings with hierarchy, decisions, and even disagreements. They spoke of rulers, architects, and judges. They lived, worked, argued, and punished. In their language, Anunnaki meant those of royal blood, or those who came from the heavens. They were the children of Anu, the great father of the sky, who ruled from above, and Ki, the goddess of earth. Together, their union gave birth to the divine council, the Anunnaki, who would shape the destiny of humankind. These were not ethereal spirits or distant deities. They were described as tangible, commanding presences, capable of walking the earth, of giving orders, of creating and destroying life. And in the earliest surviving texts, their story begins with a descent. The Enuma Elish, one of the oldest Mesopotamian creation epics, tells how the heavens and earth were once joined, and the gods came down to divide them. The Sumerians said the Anunnaki descended in a place called Eridu, the first city, the home of Enki. It was there, they said, that the world was organized, laws written, boundaries set, and humanity given purpose. The tablets describe this event in practical detail. They speak of bright lights in the sky, the roaring of storms, and the splendor of their arrival. To later readers, these lines sounded like mythic poetry, but to those who read literally, they sounded like accounts, perhaps distorted, of real events, seen through the eyes of an ancient people with no language for technology. To them, a craft would be a chariot of fire. A figure descending from the sky would simply be a god. In these stories, the world begins not with chaos, but with work. The gods labor to cultivate the earth, to shape rivers, raise crops, and mine resources. Eventually, the burden becomes too great. The lesser gods, called the Igigi, rebel against their masters. In the Atrahasis epic, they refuse to continue their toil. In response, the higher gods decide to create a new species, one that could take their place. The god Enki and the mother goddess Ninhursag perform the act of creation. They mix the flesh and blood of a god with clay from the earth. From that mixture, humankind is born, not divine, but infused with the essence of their makers. The purpose of this new being was clear: to work, to maintain the world the gods had built, and to serve as caretakers of the divine plan. It's a strange kind of creation story, not born of love or accident, but of necessity. Humans were created to relieve the labor of the gods, and yet, over time, those same gods would grant them knowledge, writing, farming, law, medicine, the tools to rule themselves. This duality, servitude and empowerment, defines every Sumerian myth that follows. Humanity was both dependent on and guided by its creators. The gods gave freely, but also demanded loyalty. Among them, two figures dominated the story: Enlil and Enki, brothers, opposites, and rivals. Enlil, the god of air and authority, ruled from the heavens. He represented order, judgment, and the divine hierarchy. He was stern, unyielding, the one who decided the fate of kings. His temple in Nippur was the spiritual heart of Sumer, the axis of the world. Enki, his younger brother, ruled from the depths, lord of water, wisdom, and creation. He was the inventor, the thinker, the protector of humankind. His temple in Eridu was said to be where life itself began, where the first man was shaped. Their conflict was philosophical as much as divine. Enlil sought obedience, Enki sought understanding. One believed in control, the other in compassion. Together, their balance maintained the world until humanity grew too ambitious. In the Sumerian flood myth, Enlil becomes enraged by humanity's noise and disobedience. He decides to send a great deluge to wipe them out. Enki, defying his brother, warns a mortal named Ziusudra to build a vessel and save life from destruction. When the waters recede, Enlil relents, granting humankind a second chance. To historians, this is the foundation of all later flood myths, including Noah's Ark. To theorists, it is something else, evidence that early humanity witnessed and survived a cataclysmic event. Some suggest the gods were leaders or survivors of a lost civilization, their powers exaggerated through time. Others take a more literal view, that the divine brothers were beings from another world, with conflicting motives toward their creation. Enlil, the overseer, saw humanity as a project gone wrong. Enki, the scientist, saw them as his children. In one of the most famous passages from the Enki and the World Order tablet, Enki boasts of distributing the me, the sacred gifts of civilization, to humankind. He gives them crafts, knowledge, and laws, but he warns that each gift carries responsibility. This story is deeply moral, almost scientific. The transmission of knowledge, not miracles. It implies that humanity's growth was not spontaneous but guided. And the guidance, the Sumerians believed, came from the Anunnaki. To modern scholars, these myths are complex metaphors, ancient ways to explain how humanity emerged from nature into society. They argue that the descent of the gods was the memory of civilization itself, not divine visitors, but the rise of structured life. To them, Enki and Enlil were personifications of order and chaos, logic and emotion, structure and freedom. Their stories reflected the human struggle between control and curiosity. But to theorists, the language of the tablets is too literal to dismiss. The texts don't speak in dreams or visions. They describe events, councils, tools, and laws with precision, as if recording administration, not myth. Ancient astronaut theorists see this as evidence of a real encounter, a time when advanced beings interacted with early humans, teaching them the foundations of civilization. What scholars call allegory, they call memory. The divide between these interpretations runs deep. Historians see mythology evolving naturally, shaped by human imagination. Theorists see mythology preserving truth, disguised by time. Both sides agree on one thing: the Sumerians believed their gods were real, not metaphorical, not symbolic, real. They built their cities around their temples. They recorded the movements of the stars that represented them. They measured their lives according to divine calendars and rituals. Whether those gods were beings of flesh or thought doesn't change their impact. For the Sumerians, the Anunnaki defined existence itself. When we read their words today, what we see depends on what we bring with us. To some, the Anunnaki are echoes of myth, human imagination reaching for meaning. To others, they are echoes of history, distorted memories of contact with something far beyond our understanding. Maybe both are true. Maybe the story of the gods from the sky is simply the story of ourselves, of how humans first began to dream beyond the limits of their world. Because even if the Anunnaki were never real, their message was that knowledge is sacred, that creation is costly, and that wisdom always comes with a price. And perhaps that is why the oldest story we have ever written begins not with man, but with those who made him. The night sky meant everything to the Sumerians. To them, the heavens weren't a mystery to be solved. They were a system to be read. Every star, every movement of the moon or planet was a sign, a message from the divine. Long before telescopes, long before the concept of gravity or orbit, the people of ancient Sumer looked upward and saw order in the cosmos. They didn't just watch the stars, they measured them. And what they recorded continues to puzzle historians and astronomers to this day. Among the thousands of clay tablets unearthed in Mesopotamia, many contain charts, lists, and calculations of celestial movements. They tracked the Sun, the Moon, Venus, Jupiter, Mars, Mercury, and Saturn, every planet visible to the naked eye. They charted eclipses, predicted lunar cycles, and understood the relationship between time and the heavens. These were not random observations. They were structured, methodical, and astonishingly accurate. The Sumerians divided the sky into 12 constellations, assigning each to a region of the heavens, what would later become the zodiac. They recorded the motion of Venus with such precision that modern astronomers were able to verify their calculations as correct to within a fraction of a degree. And this was more than 5,000 years ago. Their understanding of the sky shaped everything they built. Temples and ziggurats were aligned to celestial markers, solstices, equinoxes, and planetary risings. Each city-state had its patron god symbolized by a star or planet. To them, astronomy was not science as we define it. It was theology expressed in numbers. But beneath that faith was knowledge, a kind of early mathematics that seemed to appear from nowhere. Their counting system, based on 60, allowed them to divide the circle into 360 degrees and the hour into 60 minutes. It's a system so effective that we still use it today. From these patterns, they built the first accurate calendars used to regulate agriculture, trade, and religious festivals. They knew when the Nile would flood in Egypt, when the rivers would swell in Mesopotamia, and when the constellations would shift. They called this divine order the Me, the laws of the universe that governed everything, even the gods. But among their astronomical records, one mystery stands apart, a single symbol that has fueled centuries of speculation, a star surrounded by 11 smaller orbs. To Sumerian scribes, this represented the heavens, a complete system of celestial bodies. To modern eyes, it looks like something else, the solar system drawn thousands of years before anyone knew it existed. In this image, there are 12 objects, the Sun in the center, the Moon, and 10 planets, including one beyond Pluto, an unknown 12th planet. To the Sumerians, that outermost world had a name. They called it Nibiru. In the earliest records, Nibiru is described as the planet of the crossing, associated with the god Marduk, a figure who appears later in Babylonian mythology. The texts say Nibiru appears in the heavens at long intervals and brings change with it, sometimes creation, sometimes destruction. It was called the wandering star, the celestial gate between the gods and earth. Most scholars interpret this symbolically. Nibiru was not a planet, but a metaphor for transition, a divine passage or cycle. But alternative theorists beginning in the 20th century saw something more literal. They argued that the Sumerians were describing a real astronomical body, one that passes through our solar system every few thousand years. In 1976, author Zecharia Sitchin reignited this debate with his book, The 12th Planet. He claimed that Nibiru was a massive, distant world with an elongated orbit around the Sun, returning every 3,600 years. According to his interpretation, the Anunnaki came from this world, using it as a base to travel to Earth in the distant past. Sitchin based his theory on his translations of cuneiform tablets, particularly those describing the gods descending from the heavens and returning to their home above. He proposed that these were not metaphors but accounts of space travel, the Anunnaki as visitors from Nibiru. The idea was sensational. Gods as astronauts, myth as memory. It connected the Sumerian pantheon to physical, astronomical origins, but the academic community rejected Sitchin's translations as inaccurate, arguing that no Sumerian text explicitly describes a 12th planet or a cyclical arrival. Even so, the concept stuck. Nibiru became a permanent fixture in alternative history, the missing world that might explain the leap of knowledge in Sumer and beyond. Modern astronomy, of course, sees no evidence for such a planet in our system, at least not one that visits periodically. But interestingly, in recent years, scientists have theorized the possible existence of a Planet 9, a massive body orbiting far beyond Neptune, its presence inferred from gravitational patterns. While this doesn't validate Sitchin's Nibiru, it shows that our own understanding of the solar system remains incomplete. The Sumerians may not have seen Nibiru with telescopes, but they spoke as though the heavens were alive, cycles within cycles, patterns repeating across eternity. Their gods moved in orbits. Their fates were written in the stars. How, then, did they know so much? Without lenses or modern instruments, they measured planetary motion with accuracy we struggle to explain. Their records of Venus's 584-day cycle, found in tablets from around 1700 BCE, match today's observations almost exactly. Their predictions of lunar eclipses used methods similar to those still taught in astronomy today. It's tempting to imagine they had help, that their knowledge came from something beyond human experience. But there's another possibility, one that may be even more impressive. They may have achieved it through patience, through generations of meticulous observation. Sumerian astronomers were not just priests, they were scientists in their own way. For centuries, they tracked the heavens night after night, carving patterns into clay, passing data from father to son, temple to temple. Over thousands of years, this collective study became a kind of ancient science. In their temples, the line between religion and research disappeared. To watch the sky was to speak with the gods. To record the heavens was to preserve divine order. And so the earliest form of science was born, not in the name of discovery, but devotion. Yet even now there's a lingering unease about how complete their system was. They knew the concept of a heliocentric order, the sun at the center, though they didn't express it directly. They believed the earth was suspended in space, surrounded by a cosmic ocean. And they described paths of the gods, which could be interpreted as planetary orbits. These ideas would not resurface again until the time of Copernicus, nearly 4,000 years later. Did the Sumerians intuit it all through observation alone? Or were they preserving fragments of older knowledge, something remembered from a forgotten age, or given by teachers who vanished long before history began? The truth may lie somewhere in between. The Sumerians were brilliant observers, but they also believed the heavens were the domain of the divine. Their astronomy was both science and story, numbers wrapped in myth. To them, it wasn't enough to know how the stars moved, they needed to know why. They believed the movement of the heavens mirrored the order of life itself. Creation, destruction, and rebirth written across the night sky. Maybe that's why their knowledge feels both ancient and eternal. Because it wasn't just about the planets or their orbits. It was about understanding their place within the universe. Whether Nibiru was a metaphor or a memory, whether the Anunnaki were gods or travelers, the Sumerians left us something undeniable, the first map of the heavens. They looked up at the stars and instead of fear, they felt recognition. They believed they were part of something larger, that their lives were written in the same language as the sky. And maybe, in a way, they were right. Because every night we look up and see what they saw. The same constellations, the same stars, the same silence. Only the names have changed. If the heavens inspired the Sumerian stories, then mathematics built their world. It wasn't faith that shaped their cities, canals, and temples. It was precision. Long before Egypt raised its pyramids or Greece theorized geometry, the Sumerians were already measuring, calculating, and building with a mastery that still seems centuries ahead of its time. Every ziggurat, every irrigation system, every brick of their cities was planned according to rules we can still trace today. They weren't working by instinct or trial and error. They were following a system, one as exact as any modern engineer's blueprint. To understand just how advanced they were, we have to look at the way they thought about numbers. Most civilizations developed counting systems based on 10, our 10 fingers. The Sumerians, for reasons that remain uncertain, chose 60. Their base 60 or sexagesimal system became the foundation of all their measurements. Time, distance, angles, and astronomy all were organized around this elegant cycle. A circle, they decided, had 360 degrees. An hour contained 60 minutes, each minute 60 seconds. Even the modern calendar and compass still carry this legacy. We live by Sumerian time without realizing it. Why 60? Because it's mathematically perfect, divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. It allowed the Sumerians to perform calculations easily without fractions, using whole, balanced numbers. But what's most striking is that this was not theoretical math. It was practical, used in architecture, trade, and the alignment of temples with the stars. Their cities were designed according to geometric grids. Streets at right angles, structures aligned to celestial points. Excavations in Nippur, and Lagash reveal layouts that mirror constellations and seasonal sunrise paths. The great ziggurat of built around 2100 BCE, was not only a temple but an astronomical instrument. Its tiers faced the cardinal directions with remarkable accuracy. The angles of its stairways were aligned with the path of the moon, and its shadow marked the equinoxes. To the Sumerians, architecture was not just functional, it was cosmic. The temple was the earth's reflection of heaven, and geometry was the language connecting them. Their buildings embodied what they called divine order. Each brick placed in sequence was an act of harmony between human hands and the will of the gods. Archaeologists studying these ruins have found that the Sumerians used advanced surveying tools, plumb lines, leveling rods, and measuring ropes long before the concept of geometry was formally written down in Greece. They divided land into precise plots, calculated areas of irregular fields, and even solved problems equivalent to algebra. Clay tablets like the Plimpton 322 discovered in the early 20th century reveal knowledge that shocked modern historians. The tablet lists sets of numbers that form Pythagorean triples, relationships between the sides of right-angled triangles. This was written over 1,000 years before Pythagoras was even born. How did they know it? No one can say for certain. It's as if geometry was already part of their cultural DNA. They applied these mathematical principles everywhere, from canal networks to monumental architecture. The Sumerians built complex irrigation systems that transformed the floodplains into farmland. They designed dams, gates, and levees to control water flow with precision. Their canals were dug at exact gradients to carry water smoothly over long distances, something that would challenge engineers even today. At Lagash, archaeologists found the remnants of a water management system so sophisticated that it balanced agricultural output across multiple cities. Each canal, each reservoir was measured and recorded in cuneiform logs, complete with data on volume, distribution, and labor required. This was administration powered by mathematics, but their mastery wasn't limited to the land. Their temples reached for the sky and they built them with a structural understanding that seems almost intuitive. Ziggurats, those towering step pyramids, were constructed using layers of brick with drainage systems to resist erosion and rainfall. They used different materials at different levels: baked clay for outer walls, bitumen for waterproofing, and lighter fill for the interior to reduce weight. Even their stairways were engineered with symmetry and rhythm, creating the illusion of ascent toward the heavens. No two ziggurats were identical, but all followed similar proportions, a ratio between base width and height that appears again in later architecture, from Babylon to Persia to the early pyramids. It's as though one set of principles spread across the ancient world, geometry that transcended borders. So, where did it come from? How did a people living at the dawn of history possess a system so refined, so enduring, that we still rely on it? To most archaeologists, the answer is simple: necessity. The rivers demanded order, farming required measurement. The act of survival turned mathematics into ritual. They learned because they had to, but to others, especially those who look at the sheer completeness of their system, that explanation feels incomplete. The sexagesimal base, their use of right angles and precise ratios, their astronomical alignments, none of it appears to have evolved gradually. It all seems to appear at once. There are no primitive forms, no rough drafts. The first evidence of Sumerian math is already fully developed. This is why some have called it inherited knowledge, a system that may have come from a forgotten civilization, or perhaps, as the ancient texts themselves suggest, from the gods who descended from the sky. In one Sumerian hymn, the god Enki is praised as the Lord of Measurement and the foundations of the earth. He is said to have set in place the lines and proportions of heaven and the plans of the land. It's an odd description for a deity, less mystical, more architectural. Enki, in myth, is not only creator but engineer. He establishes the shape of the world, defines the course of rivers, and teaches humans how to build. To scholars, this language is metaphor, gods as embodiments of knowledge. But to theorists, it sounds like the description of real guidance, perhaps even direct instruction. After all, what culture invents a complete mathematical system, flawless from the start, without any record of experimentation? The deeper we look, the more this mastery reveals a mindset that feels distinctly modern. They understood ratios, area calculations, and even volume displacement. Their tablets include problems describing how to excavate earth, to fill canals, or how to determine the height of a building from its shadow. They used triangular calculations to map their cities and align them to stars. They designed monuments that mirrored constellations, including Orion and Taurus, patterns that would later reappear in Egyptian and Mesoamerican structures thousands of years later. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or perhaps evidence that ancient civilizations scattered across the world shared a common source of mathematical and architectural understanding, one that predates recorded history. Modern engineers studying Sumerian design often remark on its efficiency. They understood weight distribution, structural reinforcement, and environmental adaptation. Their buildings endured centuries of floods and shifting terrain, surviving long after empires rose and fell. Yet when we read their own explanations, they give credit not to human genius, but to the gods. They said the me, with the laws of design and proportion, they were gifts from the heavens. In their eyes, to measure the world was to speak the language of creation itself. That idea that mathematics is divine never really left us. It echoes in every scientific formula, every architectural principle, every exploration of space. Numbers, like the stars, are constants in a changing universe. So, were the Sumerians mathematicians, mystics, or messengers of something older? We may never know, but what they built still defines our concept of precision. They taught humanity how to count, to calculate, to create. They gave shape to the unseen laws that govern both stone and sky. And whether that knowledge was born of human observation or bestowed by the Anunnaki, it remains one of the greatest leaps forward our species has ever made. Long before Sumer, before cuneiform and the rise of cities, before anyone had learned to plant a single seed, something impossible was built on a hill in southern Turkey. Stone circles older than civilization itself, massive T-shaped pillars weighing up to 20 tons each, perfectly carved reliefs of animals, abstract symbols, and gods no one remembers. This place is called Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill, and it may be the oldest temple ever discovered on Earth. It was first uncovered in the 1990s when a Kurdish farmer struck stone while ploughing his field near the ancient city of Şanlıurfa. Archaeologists assumed it was another Bronze Age settlement, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 years old. But when radiocarbon dating came back, it rewrote everything we thought we knew about history. Göbekli Tepe was 12,000 years old, built around 9600 BCE, 6,000 years before the Sumerians, 7,000 years before Stonehenge, and long before the first known cities or farms. In other words, it existed at a time when humanity was supposed to still be nomadic. There should have been no temples, no priests, no monumental architecture. And yet there it was, the first cathedral in human history, rising from the Stone Age. The site consists of massive circular enclosures, each lined with monolithic pillars arranged like a ritual calendar. At the center of each circle stand two larger pillars taller than the rest, silent, symmetrical, and positioned to face one another. Carved into them are images of lions, snakes, foxes, vultures, and creatures that no longer exist. There are no domestic structures, no homes, no hearths, no sign of ordinary life. Göbekli Tepe was not a village, it was a place of gathering, a temple before gods had names. And that's what makes it so extraordinary, because it suggests that religion, the act of coming together to worship something greater, existed before civilization, not after. We didn't invent faith to explain our world. Faith might have built it. What's even stranger is how advanced the engineering was. Each pillar was carved from solid limestone using primitive stone tools. Some weigh more than a commercial truck. They were transported from nearby quarries, set upright in sockets and perfectly balanced without mortar. To do this would have required hundreds of workers, careful planning, and architectural understanding that should have been far beyond a hunter-gatherer society. And yet, the builders did it, again and again, across multiple enclosures, each slightly different in size and style. Archaeologists estimate it took centuries to complete, long enough that generations would have been born and died during its construction. And then, suddenly, it was buried. That may be the strangest part of all. At some point around 8000 BCE, the people who built Göbekli Tepe deliberately covered it with earth and stone. The entire complex was entombed, preserved under layers of soil for reasons no one can explain. It wasn't destroyed by war or nature, it was hidden intentionally, as if the builders wanted it to disappear. Some believe this was an act of reverence, a ceremonial burial of a sacred place. Others think it was fear, that something happened there they wanted to seal away forever. Whatever the reason, it worked. For nearly 10,000 years, Göbekli Tepe slept beneath the hills, untouched and forgotten. So who built it? That's the question that haunts every excavation. No written records, no known culture to claim it. The people who carved those stones vanished, leaving only the work itself. One theory suggests they were the ancestors of the Sumerians, the proto-civilization that would eventually move south and found Mesopotamia. The similarities are tempting, Both cultures revered the heavens, used animal symbols, and built monumental temples aligned to celestial points. Others proposed that Göbekli Tepe was the center of a lost, pre-agricultural civilization, one erased by time or catastrophe, its survivors passing fragments of their knowledge to later cultures. This idea of an ancient, advanced society predating all known history has long fascinated researchers and dreamers alike. It would mean civilization didn't begin in Sumer or Egypt. It began here, in the shadows of Anatolia, at the end of the last ice age. Recent studies have revealed astronomical alignments at the site. Some pillars appear oriented toward the constellation Orion, others toward Sirius, the dog star that would later hold sacred significance in Egypt. Computer models suggest that Göbekli Tepe may have been designed as a kind of sky temple, a stone observatory marking the movements of the stars. If true, it would make its builders not just craftsmen, but astronomers, mapping the heavens before agriculture even began. This changes everything about how we understand human development. We've always believed that civilization created science and religion. Göbekli Tepe suggests it may have been the other way around, that spiritual or celestial knowledge inspired civilization itself. For archaeologists, the site represents a turning point, the bridge between prehistory and history. For others, it hints at something even more radical, the survival of knowledge from an earlier world. Alternative researchers have long speculated about lost civilizations, cultures destroyed by global floods, remembered in myths like Atlantis, Lemuria, and the flood of Noah. Some wonder if Göbekli Tepe could be the last echo of that forgotten age, a remnant of humanity's first rise, erased and reborn. There's even a theory that connects it to the Anunnaki, the gods of Sumerian legend. If the Sumerians inherited their knowledge from divine teachers, could those teachers have once walked among the builders of Göbekli Tepe? It's an intriguing thought, a bridge across 6,000 years of silence. But here, fact and speculation blur. No artifact or inscription links Göbekli Tepe directly to Sumer. What connects them is mystery, the sudden, unexplained appearance of brilliance where none should exist. The mainstream view remains cautious. Archaeologists argue that Göbekli Tepe's builders were still hunter-gatherers, highly organized, yes, but not a lost civilization. They see the site as evidence of humanity's capacity for cooperation and imagination even before farming. It's a powerful, humanistic explanation, and it may well be true, but it still leaves one problem unsolved. How could a nomadic people, scattered and untrained, design, carve, and assemble megaliths with such precision? How could they create a structure that would remain the world's largest religious monument for over 7,000 years? And why, when they finished, did they hide it so carefully? Göbekli Tepe feels like a message left behind, one that we were never meant to find so early. Its carvings, its geometry, its deliberate burial, all hint at knowledge that didn't belong to its time. Whether that knowledge was born from human genius or inherited from something older, it marks a clear truth. Civilization did not begin once. It began twice. Once here, in stone circles buried beneath Turkish soil, and once again, thousands of years later, in the temples of Sumer. Two awakenings, separated by time, united by mystery. Today, Göbekli Tepe stands at the threshold of what we can prove and what we can only imagine. Its pillars still face the same stars they did 12,000 years ago. The carvings still whisper the same forgotten symbols. And beneath it, layers of unexcavated chambers still wait, sealed by the hands that built them. Whoever they were, they wanted their work to last forever. And it has. Maybe the people of Göbekli Tepe were not gods or aliens or architects of the impossible. Maybe they were simply us, dreamers, builders, and seekers of meaning. People who looked at the stars and tried to carve their reflection into stone. And if that's true, then perhaps the real lost civilization isn't gone. It's the part of us that still remembers what it means to wonder. For thousands of years, the story of the Anunnaki slept in clay, sealed beneath deserts, forgotten by time. Then, in the 20th century, a man named Zecharia Sitchin cracked those tablets open again and turned an ancient myth into one of the most debated theories in modern history. To some, he was a visionary who exposed a hidden truth about our origins. To others, he was a gifted storyteller who blurred the line between translation and imagination. Either way, his work changed how the world saw the Sumerians, not as a lost civilization, but as a civilization that may have remembered something humanity was never meant to forget. Sitchin was born in 1920, educated in history and economics, and spoke multiple languages. In the 1970s, while researching ancient Near Eastern texts, he claimed to have uncovered evidence that the gods of Sumer were not gods at all, but visitors from another world. His book, The 12th Planet, published in 1976, introduced what he called the ancient astronaut theory. It suggested that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials who came to Earth from a distant planet named Nibiru, which orbits our Sun in a long elliptical path, returning every 3,600 years. According to his interpretation, these beings arrived tens of thousands of years ago to mine gold, a resource they needed to repair their planet's atmosphere. Finding labor too difficult, they genetically engineered early humans by mixing their own DNA with that of primitive hominids. Humanity, he said, was created as a working species, half earthly, half divine. It was a theory that merged science fiction with archaeology, and for many it made perfect sense. Sitchin's argument rested on his personal translations of ancient Sumerian and Akkadian tablets. He claimed that the word Anunnaki literally meant those who from heaven to earth came, and the descriptions of their fiery chariots were primitive accounts of spacecraft. He also pointed to Sumerian astronomical texts which appeared to depict a 12th planet, beyond Neptune and Pluto. These, he said, were not myths, they were records. Accounts of real beings, real events, and real interactions between gods and men. The idea was radical, but it arrived at the perfect time. The 1970s were a decade obsessed with space. Just years earlier, humanity had walked on the moon. UFO sightings were headline news. Television shows like Star Trek and Chariots of the Gods were turning cosmic speculation into popular culture. In that atmosphere of curiosity and wonder, Sitchin's theories spread fast. He was articulate, confident, and backed his claims with extensive research and images of ancient artifacts that seemed to support his case. The story of the Anunnaki, once buried in forgotten languages, was suddenly alive again. But as interest grew, so did criticism. Mainstream scholars argued that Sitchin's translations were not just flawed, they were fundamentally wrong. The word Anunnaki, they said, simply meant princely offspring or royal bloodline, referring to the gods of the underworld, not space travelers. The term Nibiru, according to standard Mesopotamian astronomy, referred to Jupiter, or sometimes Mercury, depending on the era, not an undiscovered planet. Cuneiform experts pointed out that Sitchin was not a trained linguist, and many of his key interpretations relied on stretching the meaning of words or combining phrases that never appeared together in the original texts. In other words, he built a bridge of logic that the tablets themselves did not support. Still, his books sold millions. Because while academics argued over grammar, readers were drawn to something deeper, the possibility. Sitchin's theory gave humanity a new origin story, one that felt both ancient and modern. It explained the sudden rise of civilization, the gods who descended from the heavens, and the mysteries of lost knowledge that seemed too advanced for its time. It also offered a comforting paradox, that we were both created and chosen, not by divine miracle, but by design. To his followers, the Anunnaki weren't monsters or enslavers. They were teachers. Beings who shaped our destiny, left their mark and departed, leaving behind the stories that became our myths. For skeptics, though, the danger was clear. Sitchin's narrative blurred evidence and imagination so skillfully that it became hard to separate the two. And in that blur, conspiracy theories found fertile ground. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Sitchin's ideas had evolved into a movement. Documentaries, online forums, and television series, most notably Ancient Aliens, expanded on his work. They linked the Anunnaki to pyramids, crop circles, and nearly every unexplained mystery in human history. Each claim added spectacle, but not clarity, and soon the original Sumerian context, the clay, the history, the culture, began to fade beneath layers of speculation. Today, mention the word Anunnaki, and you'll hear everything from genetic engineering to reptilian overlords to planetary conspiracies. But somewhere beneath all that noise still lies the real story, a story written in the cradle of civilization, not the stars. So what remains when we strip the myth back to its clay roots? What part of the story still defies explanation, even under scrutiny? First, the Sumerians' sudden sophistication. No one disputes that civilization appeared in Mesopotamia almost fully formed, cities, writing, astronomy, and law all emerging together. We can map the timeline, but not the leap. Second, their knowledge of the heavens, their mapping of planetary orbits, their division of time, their cosmic mythology, all are remarkably advanced for their era. Whether this knowledge came from slow observation or something older remains unclear. And finally, the consistency of the myth. Across thousands of tablets, the Anunnaki appear again and again, named, ranked, described in action. Their personalities evolve through retellings, but their presence never fades. It's as though the Sumerians were preserving not just a belief, but a memory. Those are the facts. Everything else, the spacecraft, the planet Nibiru, the alien DNA, rests on interpretation. In fairness, not all of Sitchin's ideas were impossible. His base concept, that myth might encode ancient memory, has since been explored seriously by archaeologists and anthropologists. Many agree that stories of sky gods could reflect real events, meteor showers, cosmic impacts, or encounters with travelers from distant lands, or, more metaphorically, the arrival of knowledge itself, the awakening of consciousness in early humans. But Sitchin's leap from symbolism to literal extraterrestrial visitors remains unproven. It may always remain that way, because to prove the ancient astronaut theory, one would need physical evidence, technology, artifacts, or DNA, and none has ever been found. Only words in stone and the silence between them. Still, the idea endures because it touches something universal, our fascination with the unknown. Whether we call them gods, angels, or aliens, we've always looked beyond ourselves for answers. We want to believe that our story began with contact, that somewhere out there are those who shaped us and might one day return. And perhaps in a symbolic way, they already have. Because every time we rediscover a buried truth, decode an ancient language, or stare into the night sky searching for meaning, we're continuing the same conversation the Sumerians began. The Anunnaki may not have come from the heavens, but they made us look there. In the end, the ancient astronaut theory isn't just about aliens, it's about origins, about how humanity turns mystery into story, and how those stories, told often enough, begin to feel like memory. Sitchin's legacy is complicated. He reshaped ancient history for a modern age of wonder. He asked questions others were afraid to ask, and even if his answers were flawed, the act of asking kept the mystery alive. Because, in the absence of proof, what remains is possibility. And that, perhaps, is what keeps the Anunnaki eternal, not as gods, not as visitors, but as the reflection of our own endless curiosity. By the time Sumer's last city-states faded into dust, its ideas had already crossed the deserts and rivers, carried on clay, trade routes, and memory. Civilizations rise and fall, but knowledge travels. And in the case of Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, that knowledge didn't just travel, it transformed the world. What began in the low plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers would ripple outward for thousands of years, shaping the languages, laws, and beliefs of nearly every great culture that followed. When the Sumerians built their first cities, Uruk, Lagash, Eridu, they created more than monuments. They created templates. Every major civilization that rose after them, Babylon, Assyria, the Hittites, and even Egypt, borrowed from their systems of writing, measurement, and belief. It was not imitation, but evolution. The world learning to speak a language that Sumer had invented. The world's first writing system, cuneiform, was one of their greatest gifts. At first, it was used for simple records, grain, trade, and taxes. But soon, those wedge-shaped marks began to record poetry, law, and philosophy. From these tablets came the rhythm of administration, the power of contracts, and the concept of written memory itself, the idea that words could outlive their speaker. And once words could be carried, so could ideas. The influence spread north and east through trade. Sumerian merchants traveled with caravans of silver, copper, and grain, exchanging not just goods, but the knowledge. Their scribes taught neighboring peoples how to count, measure, and record. Their architects showed others how to build with mud brick, how to design canals and temples, how to harness rivers instead of fear them. As time passed, new empires rose in their place, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, and later the Assyrians. Each built on Sumer's foundation, adopting its gods, its scripts, and its sciences. The Akkadian king Sargon the Great, often called the first empire builder in history, united Mesopotamia under one rule. He adopted the Sumerian system of government, retained its priesthoods, and ordered scribes to copy the old tablets into the Akkadian tongue. Because of that, the Sumerian language survived for nearly 2,000 years after its speakers were gone. It became the Latin of its time, a language of learning used only by scholars and the temples. Knowledge preserved by those who barely understood its age. As Mesopotamia grew, so did its reach. Trade routes extended westward toward Egypt and east toward the Indus Valley. And with every exchange of metals, textiles, spices, came something invisible but far more enduring: ideas. The earliest Egyptian hieroglyphs appeared not long after cuneiform reached its height. Both systems relied on symbols for sounds, objects, and concepts. Both recorded kingship, gods, and law. And both placed cosmic order, the balance between heaven and earth, at the heart of existence. Did Egypt invent its system independently? Most historians believe so. But the timing, the parallels, and the unmistakable echoes of Sumerian structure raise a tantalizing possibility that the spark of written thought began in one place and spread like fire through the ancient world. Religion, too, traveled these same paths. The Sumerians had described the heavens as a council of gods, powerful, flawed, and deeply human in their emotions. They built temples not to worship at a distance, but to house these gods among them. That same idea, gods as rulers in human form, would reappear in Babylon, in the Egyptian pharaohs, and later in Greek mythology. When the Babylonians rose to power, they inherited the Sumerian pantheon almost entirely. The god Enlil became Bel, Inanna became Ishtar, and Enki became Ea, different names, same essence. Even the great flood story rewritten in Babylon's Epic of Gilgamesh was an echo of Sumer's older myth of Ziusudra. To them, the past wasn't dead, it was inherited, and every culture that followed would take a fragment of it, reshape it, and call it their own. The Assyrians, fierce and ambitious, took this inheritance and forged it into empire. They built vast cities, Nineveh, Ashur, Nimrud, filled with libraries and palaces decorated in reliefs that mirrored Sumer's ancient symbols. One of the greatest discoveries of modern archaeology, the Library of Ashurbanipal, held more than 30,000 clay tablets, many copied directly from older Sumerian and Babylonian texts. Within them were star charts, medical manuals, and myths thousands of years old. Through the Assyrians, the knowledge of Sumer survived even longer, preserved not by belief, but by bureaucracy. It's a strange kind of immortality, not divine, but administrative. The question is how much of that knowledge truly originated in Sumer, and how much was carried forward from even earlier, forgotten cultures. Because buried within the Sumerian tablets are hints that they too saw themselves as inheritors, not inventors. They spoke of the me, the divine decrees of civilization, as something given, not created, and they described the founding of their cities as restoration, not innovation. To them, Eridu, their first city, was built on the ruins of an older world. In their own myths, civilization had already come once, been destroyed by flood, and begun again. If that's true, then perhaps Sumer wasn't the start of history at all. It was the restart. This pattern, knowledge appearing fully formed, spreading rapidly, then vanishing, repeats across time. In Egypt, we see the sudden rise of pyramid building, astronomical precision, and hieroglyphic writing. In the Indus Valley, vast planned cities with drainage systems centuries ahead of their age. In Mesoamerica, pyramids and calendars that echo the same celestial focus. Are these coincidences, or traces of an earlier global memory? Historians lean toward cultural diffusion, that trade and migration allowed ideas to travel naturally, evolving as they moved. But some researchers see a deeper thread, not exchange, but inheritance. A knowledge too advanced, too synchronized, to have evolved independently on every continent. Mesopotamia's position made it a crossroads, not just geographically, but intellectually. It sat between worlds, the mountains of Anatolia, the deserts of Arabia, and the rivers that opened to the Persian Gulf. Every traveler, every trader, every migration passed through this narrow corridor. That constant movement made it the first hub of global thought. Mathematics, writing, architecture, astronomy, core the foundations of civilization, radiated outward from this small strip of land, carried by generations who didn't even know they were shaping the future. The irony is that the more this knowledge spread, the more its origins were forgotten. Each culture believed itself to be the beginning. Each claimed the gods had taught them first. But somewhere in the chain, the original source disappeared, replaced by legend. Today, we can trace the fingerprints of Sumer across the map. The sexagesimal math in our clocks, the legal codes that mirror Hammurabi's, the flood myths that echo through scripture. All roads lead back to the same rivers. But the origin of that river of thought remains hidden. Was it simply the genius of early humanity, thriving in the cradle of fertile land? Or was it something older, passed down through forgotten centuries, preserved in fragments? First at Göbekli Tepe, then in Sumer, and then carried forward again. Maybe civilization isn't a line, but a cycle, knowledge rising, falling, and resurfacing under new names. For the people of Mesopotamia, it didn't matter who first lit the spark. What mattered was keeping it alive. Through clay tablets, temple schools, and trade caravans, they ensured that even as empires fell, the ideas of Sumer would endure. And in that sense they succeeded, because even now, 5,000 years later, we still live by their measures, read their myths, and follow the same stars they charted. They were the first to connect heaven and earth, through story, through science, through trade. And in doing so, they connected all of us. The story of the Anunnaki and the civilization that first recorded it comes to us not as a complete tale, but as fragments, pieces of clay, broken symbols, half-sentences carved 5,000 years ago and buried under centuries of silence. Every word we read about Sumer, every line of its myths, every theory we build upon them, all rest on what survived. And what survived is incomplete. Most of what we know about Mesopotamia comes from cuneiform tablets, fragile slabs of clay pressed with wedge-shaped marks. Thousands have been found, but only a fraction have been translated. And many of those are damaged, chipped, weathered, or missing entire sections. A single missing sign can change meaning completely. One line can shift a god's role, a verb can turn a creation story into a metaphor, or a simple word for sky can become heaven. That's the challenge of reconstructing a language no one has spoken for millennia. Interpretation. Archaeologists and linguists don't just read the tablets. They rebuild them. They fill gaps with educated guesses guided by context, by parallels, and sometimes by instinct. In between the preserved words are stretches of silence that we fill with our own assumptions, and in those silences entire worlds can be rewritten. Take the story of creation itself. In Sumerian, the world begins when heaven was separated from earth. To a modern translator, that sounds poetic, a mythic way of describing the formation of the sky. But the original word for heaven, An, also meant sky god, and sometimes even high place or distant realm. If a scribe thousands of years later read that line differently, what might it become? Heaven was separated from earth could also read as those of the sky separated themselves from those of the earth. Two translations. One divine act, the other a departure. An exodus from the heavens. We build our understanding of the ancient world on choices like that. Translation is never neutral, its interpretation through the lens of time. When scholars first uncovered the tablets in the 19th century, they were men of their era, rationalists, Christians, humanists, interpreting myths through the framework they knew. To them, heaven could only mean the divine. Flight could only mean metaphor. And the gods of Sumer could only be symbolic. They weren't wrong. They were cautious. But it's possible that their caution softened meanings that the ancient world took literally. Because in Sumerian, the language itself doesn't clearly separate myth from reality. The same word might mean to rise, to ascend, or to fly. The same phrase could describe a storm, a god's descent, or something else entirely. Something mechanical, perhaps, if we chose to read it that way. One striking example lies in a recurring phrase found in the tablets describing the Anunnaki. They came down in glory, shining as fire, roaring like the tempest. In modern translation, that becomes poetic, a divine arrival clothed in natural imagery. But linguistically, roaring like the tempest could describe sound, engines, thunder, or something loud and alien. The word glory could also mean radiance, brightness, even heat. Are these metaphors for divinity, or the only words an ancient writer had to describe something beyond comprehension? We can't know for certain, because we're translating not just language, but worldview. Even the word Anunnaki itself is debated. Depending on how it's broken down, it can mean offspring of Anu, royal bloodline, or those who came from heaven to earth. All three are technically correct, and each one points to a different understanding of the same myth. That's how fragile the record is. Every meaning rests on how we choose to read a sign, how we reconstruct a line, how we define a symbol that no longer has a living speaker. The Sumerians never wrote explanations. They didn't footnote their metaphors. They assumed their readers, their descendants, would understand. But we don't. We're guessing through a veil of 3,000 years and 4 dead languages. And then there's what we've lost completely. For every tablet that survives, dozens more have crumbled away. Entire libraries were destroyed in wars and fires long before archaeology began. Even the library of Ashurbanipal, one of the greatest collections of ancient knowledge, was found in ruins. The tablets charred, shattered, their edges fused by heat. Many were only half legible. Scholars pieced them together like puzzles, sometimes joining fragments from sites hundreds of miles apart. It's slow, uncertain work, and in the spaces between those fragments, interpretation fills the void. Imagine reading a novel where every 5th page is missing and the rest are in a language you've never heard before. That's what reconstructing Sumerian history is like. These gaps don't just affect the myths. They alter how we understand science, architecture, and belief. For example, when a tablet describes a heavenly boat or chariot of the gods, is that religious imagery or a literal description of technology viewed through an ancient lens? The word for boat in Sumerian, magur, can also mean vessel. It's used interchangeably for ships, temples, and even containers of divine power. So when a text says the gods rode the vessels of heaven, modern translators naturally assume metaphor. But that's still an assumption. In a culture where gods walked among men, where temples doubled as observatories, it's not unthinkable that heavenly vessels could have meant something tangible. But because the context is missing, we can never know which meaning they intended and which one we've invented. Even more complex is how later civilizations reshaped these ideas. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, and the Hebrews all borrowed Sumerian stories, rewriting them in their own languages, adding, removing, reinterpreting. By the time the stories reached the modern world, they had already passed through centuries of translation. What we call myth today might have once been memory, and what we read as history might once have been allegory. Our certainty about what the ancients meant is often an illusion built on fragments of clay and the spaces between them. Modern technology has helped close some of these gaps. Digital imaging allows scholars to read tablets too fragile to touch. Artificial intelligence can predict missing signs based on grammar and context. But no technology can replace the parts that were never written: the tone, the nuance, the belief. When a Sumerian scribe wrote of the gods ascending to the stars, did he imagine literal ascent? Or was he describing death, transcendence, or power? Both readings are possible, and that duality is what keeps the mystery alive. Because in the end, our understanding of Sumer isn't built on certainty, it's built on reconstruction. Every discovery brings answers, but also new questions. Every translation is an act of interpretation, shaped by the translator's era, culture, and imagination. Perhaps we've misunderstood heaven as something spiritual when it once meant something physical, the sky itself. Perhaps creation didn't mean forming humanity from clay, but shaping it through knowledge. Perhaps flight wasn't symbolic, just poorly described. Or perhaps we've read too much into symbols that were never meant to be literal at all. The truth, like the tablets, may always remain incomplete. What we can say is this: the Sumerians left us more than myths. They left us an unsolved language, half preserved and half lost, a bridge between history and imagination. And maybe that's why their stories still feel alive, because they exist in that space between translation and meaning, where faith meets reason, where metaphor meets memory. Every time we fill in the blanks, we bring them back to life, but we also rewrite them in our own image. In that way, the Sumerians haven't vanished. They're still speaking, through fragments, through questions, through us. Every civilization leaves its echoes. Some fade quietly. Others ripple through time, reshaping the myths and beliefs of those who come after. The Anunnaki belong to the second kind. They began as the divine council of Sumer, gods who ordered the world, judged the dead, and ruled the forces of nature. But long after the last Sumerian tablet was written, their shadows lingered, transformed, renamed, reinterpreted, appearing again and again across empires and eras. Their story didn't end when Sumer fell, it simply changed form. When the Babylonians rose to power around 1800 BCE, they inherited Sumer's gods, language, and myths, but they gave them new hierarchy and meaning. At the center of their pantheon stood Marduk, the storm god who defeated chaos and established order. He was, in many ways, the Babylonian reinterpretation of the older Sumerian gods, a synthesis of Enlil's authority, Enki's wisdom, and the celestial might of Anu. The Anunnaki, once a vast collective of divine figures, were reimagined as Marduk's servants, 77 deities who enacted his will upon earth. The Babylonian Enuma Elish describes them gathering after Marduk's victory over the primordial sea dragon, Tiamat, to decree the laws of heaven and earth. They built the world anew, assigning roles, setting boundaries, and organizing the cosmos, mirroring the way early empires organized their cities and states. Already myth and power were blending. In Marduk's triumph, Babylon saw its own destiny, a divine mandate to rule. As centuries passed, the same stories found new homes in Assyria and Akkad. The Assyrians inherited Marduk but renamed him Ashur, their national god. In their temples, carvings showed winged figures, human in shape but divine in presence, placing a pinecone-shaped object toward a tree of life. These beings, often labeled by modern historians as Apkallu, or Watchers, were said to have brought knowledge to humankind, art, writing, and wisdom. They were intermediaries between gods and men, half divine and half earthly. In form and purpose, they resembled the Anunnaki, beings of immense knowledge descending to instruct, to guide, or, in later myths, to judge. By the time these stories reached the Levant, they began to shift again. In the Hebrew scriptures, the old polytheistic world compressed into a single divine order, one God above, one creation below. Yet even here, echoes of the older Sumerian framework survived. In the book of Genesis, there are the Nephilim, mysterious beings described as the sons of God who came down to the daughters of men. They were described as giants, mighty men of old, born of a union between heaven and earth. Scholars have long debated who or what the Nephilim were, angels, fallen beings, or ancient heroes. But the parallel with the Anunnaki is unmistakable, divine entities descending, mingling with humanity, and leaving behind both wisdom and ruin. The flood that follows in Genesis, sent to cleanse the world, mirrors the Sumerian story of Ziusudra and the Babylonian flood of Utnapishtim. The same pattern retold in different tongues, humanity guided then punished by those from above. As time went on, the divine became moralized. The Sumerian gods, once complex and imperfect, turned into clear symbols of good and evil. The Anunnaki, once bringers of civilization, became In later Judeo-Christian tradition, fallen angels, rebels against heaven. What was once divine descent became the fall, and the beings who once gave knowledge became figures of temptation. Lucifer, the Watchers, the ones who taught forbidden art. The transformation is striking. The same archetype, beings of power who shape mankind, reinterpreted across thousands of years, each culture projecting its own fears and values onto them. To the Sumerians, they were gods. To the Babylonians, administrators of heaven. To the Hebrews, dangerous intermediaries. And to later mystics, perhaps, reminders of a time when the boundary between heaven and earth was thin. These ideas continued to evolve through the ancient Mediterranean. In Greece, the Titans, the elder gods who ruled before Zeus, echoed the same themes, a celestial dynasty overthrown, their powers sealed away. Prometheus, who gave fire to mankind, was punished for his gift, just as Enki defied Enlil to help humanity survive. In Egypt, the Neteru, the gods of the Nile, carried echoes of Sumerian structure, divine families, cosmic order, balance between chaos and creation. Even their myths of sky and earth, Nut and Geb, resemble the Sumerian union of Anu and Ki. These weren't copies. They were reflections, ancient ideas refracted through time and geography. Each culture adapted the story to its own landscape, its own gods, its own understanding of the divine. But the essence stayed the same, that humankind was shaped by forces greater than itself. When the Renaissance rediscovered the ancient world, scholars once again began translating Sumerian and Babylonian texts. For the first time in nearly 3,000 years, the names Enki, Enlil, and Anu returned to human speech. In the 19th century, explorers like Henry Rawlinson and Austin Henry Layard uncovered entire libraries of cuneiform tablets. Among them were myths that would directly influence the modern imagination, stories of creation, floods, and gods descending from the stars. Writers, artists, and philosophers found in these texts the roots of every later myth, the common DNA of human spirituality. Painters imagined winged gods standing over ancient cities. Poets wrote of watchers and giants, and slowly the Anunnaki became symbols of something larger, our eternal fascination with where we come from, and who might have been here before us. In the 20th century, that fascination took on a new shape. As humanity reached the skies with flight and rockets, the heavens became literal again. Suddenly, those who came from above no longer sounded like allegory. It sounded like possibility. The ancient astronaut theory revived the Anunnaki as beings of flesh and technology, visitors from another world. Books, films, and documentaries transformed them into explorers, colonizers, or creators. Ancient visitors who may have walked among our ancestors. In modern media, they appear everywhere, in science fiction, in video games, in speculative documentaries. Their imagery, tall, winged, luminous, has become an icon of the unknown. But in every version, one thing remains: the Anunnaki as a mirror. They reflect whatever humanity believes about itself. Once divine students of wisdom, now seekers of the stars. It's easy to dismiss these transformations as myth-making, but myths have a strange endurance. They evolve because they contain something timeless, a truth that doesn't depend on literal fact. The Anunnaki endure because they embody our oldest question. Did we learn civilization by ourselves, or was it given to us? That question has no final answer, and maybe it doesn't need one, because in every retelling, from Sumerian tablets to digital screens, they stand for the same thing: the spark of creation, the mystery of knowledge, and the cost of power. They are the gods who gave us order and the rebels who defied it. They are the memory of something larger than ourselves, and whether they were ever real, they remain alive in the stories we continue to tell. In that way, the Anunnaki are not just ancient figures, they are cultural constants. They began as beings of clay and light ruling over the first cities. Now they exist in code, film, and imagination, ruling the world of myth once again. The world has changed, but the pattern hasn't. Every age reshapes them. Every civilization names them anew. And each time they remind us of the same truth, that humanity is both student and storyteller, forever caught between the earth that made us and the stars we reach for. History is supposed to be a straight line. That's what we're taught, that human progress moves forward, step by step, from stone to bronze to steel. But when you look closely at the earliest civilizations, at Sumer, at Egypt, at the megaliths that stand older than both, the line begins to blur. It bends backward towards something that doesn't quite fit the timeline. There are moments when humanity seems to awaken suddenly, fully formed, moments like the rise of Sumer, when cities, mathematics, and written language appear almost overnight. And when you trace those moments, you find fragments of stories, alignments in stone, and names half erased, whispers of something older. Maybe civilization didn't begin once, maybe it began again. Among the oldest cities in Sumerian tradition is Eridu. To archaeologists, it's a tell, a layered mound of mud brick and clay, built and rebuilt over thousands of years. But to the Sumerians themselves, Eridu wasn't just their first city. It was the first city ever built. They called it the home of Enki, the god of wisdom and water. In their king lists, Eridu is where kingship descended from heaven. And before the flood, the same flood echoed later in Babylon and in the Bible, Eridu was the center of the world. When excavations began there in the 1940s, archaeologists expected to find early farming villages, simple huts, crude tools. Instead, they uncovered temple foundations, tiered structures that grew layer upon layer, each older than the last. The deepest levels date back to around 5400 BCE, far earlier than most cities were thought to exist. But the deeper they dug, the stranger it got. At a certain depth, the ruins ended abruptly, replaced by sterile sand. It was as if the ground itself had been scrubbed clean. The earliest phase of Eridu was gone, erased by time, or something else. What lies beneath that sand remains unknown. No inscriptions, no debris, no artifacts to tell who the first builders were. Only the memory, preserved in later texts, that before the flood, Eridu was. It's one of history's quietest mysteries, not dramatic, not cinematic, but haunting, because it suggests that Sumer began not with invention, but with reconstruction, that they were remembering something older, something they didn't fully understand. Across the world, similar enigmas appear. At Göbekli Tepe, 6,000 years before Eridu, we saw monumental temples built before farming. In Egypt, megalithic structures like the Sphinx and the core stones of the Great Pyramid still defy our sense of what early builders should have been capable of. And in South America, at sites like Puma Punku and Sacsayhuaman, precision cut blocks weigh hundreds of tons, fitted so tightly that a blade can't pass between them. None of these are connected by culture or geography. But they share one trait, anachronism. They appear too early, too advanced, too deliberate. As if pieces of a puzzle scattered across millennia, built by hands that remembered techniques long since forgotten. Mainstream archaeology offers explanations, ingenuity, trial and error, or lost local knowledge. But there's an underlying pattern that nags at the edges, a rise, a fall, a silence, then a rediscovery. Even the stars seem to hint at continuity. Many ancient monuments, in Egypt, Mesopotamia, South America, align perfectly with celestial markers, solstices, equinoxes, constellations like Orion or Sirius. These alignments weren't random, they required careful observation over generations and mathematical precision that shouldn't have existed so early. In Sumer, temples and ziggurats were oriented toward star paths. In Egypt, the pyramids point to the belt of Orion. In Central America, Mayan temples mark equinox, sunrises with shadow and light. Different worlds, different cultures, same sky, same alignment. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or maybe remembrance, a shared memory of how heaven and earth once moved together. But for all we've uncovered, our record of the ancient world remains painfully incomplete. Even in Mesopotamia, the most excavated region on Earth, most of what once existed is still buried or gone. Less than 10% of known Sumerian sites have been explored. Countless tablets remain untranslated, sealed in museum archives, or lost to looting and erosion. Each fragment we do find is a fraction of a story, a single voice from a vanished library. Imagine reading a 1,000-page book when only 50 pages survive, and those scattered out of order. That's what our picture of prehistory looks like. We fill the gaps with theories, but the truth, whatever it is, might lie in the missing pages. Some researchers believe that if a civilization existed before Sumer, an unknown precursor, its remains may not have survived at all. Most human settlements before 10,000 BCE would have been coastal, built near rivers and shores. But at the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose more than 400 feet. Entire landscapes vanished beneath the waves. That means if there was an earlier chapter, cities, temples, or ports, it's now under the ocean, buried beneath silt and salt. And indeed, in places like the Gulf of Cambay in India, Doggerland off the coast of Britain, and the Caribbean shelf, sonar has found traces of structures where land once stood. We can't yet prove they were human, but the possibility lingers. That we are only seeing the last act of a story much older than we remember. It's tempting to dismiss these puzzles as coincidence. The human brain's pattern-seeking instinct projecting connections where none exist. But it's also possible that the patterns are real, not evidence of aliens or lost continents, but of human continuity. Civilization may not be a sudden spark, but a fire rekindled, knowledge remembered rather than discovered. What if humanity didn't learn how to build temples or chart the stars? What if it relearned? If so, then Sumer's sudden brilliance isn't an anomaly. It's the first visible re-emergence of something ancient, something passed down in whispers across forgotten generations. That idea isn't proof, but it's a humbling possibility. Even now, our understanding of early history changes with every discovery. New digs reveal cities older than we imagined. New translations shift meanings once thought certain. Science expands what's possible, and in turn deepens the mystery. Each find raises a quiet question. Have we misunderstood the timeline itself? Because history, as we know it, is written from what survives, not from what was. We see the high points, not the hidden foundations, and in that way our view of the past might be less a photograph and more a shadow, shaped as much by absence as by fact. So how much of what we call history is memory? Stories carried through myth, reshaped by time. And how much is invention? A tapestry woven to make sense of what little we have left. When the Sumerians spoke of gods descending, of cities rising from floodplains, of laws gifted from heaven, were they recording what they saw, or preserving fragments of something older through the only language they knew? Story? Perhaps myth is not a distortion of truth, but its disguise, a way of remembering without understanding. In that sense, history isn't wrong, It's incomplete. It's the echo of a voice we're still trying to hear clearly. Every tablet, every ruin, every carved line is a word in that unfinished sentence, a sentence written by humanity across thousands of years. And maybe, as more of it is uncovered, the story will sound less like a line and more like a circle, because circles don't end, they return. And so too, perhaps, does civilization. We may never know whether there was truly a forgotten people behind Sumer's sudden rise, whether the knowledge of the gods was really human genius, divine memory, or something in between. But we can feel its presence in the patterns that repeat, in the monuments that align, and in the stories that survive. It's as if the world itself remembers, even when we forget. Night falls slowly over the desert. The last heat of the day fades into stillness, and the dunes turn from gold to ash beneath a sky heavy with stars. Somewhere out there, under layers of sand, beneath ruins older than memory, the first stories still sleep. The Sumerians called this place Eden before the flood. The Greeks later named it Mesopotamia, the land between rivers. And we, looking back across 6,000 years, call it the birthplace of civilization. But maybe it was also something else. Maybe it was the beginning of a question that humanity has been asking ever since. Who are we? Where did we come from? And why do we still look to the heavens for answers? The desert has always been a good keeper of secrets. It buries what we lose and returns it only when the time is right. Clay tablets, bones, fragments of walls, tiny pieces of a story that once filled entire worlds. Every artifact is a whisper, every ruin a pause between words. And when we read those fragments today, when we trace the wedge marks of cuneiform or the outlines of a forgotten god, we're not just uncovering history, we're listening to the echo of the first human voices that ever asked, why? That, more than anything, may be what the Anunnaki represent. Not beings of power, not literal gods or visitors from beyond, but the shape of an ancient question. The earliest attempt to explain the unexplainable. They were the reflection of awe, the moment when humanity looked up from the dust and realized that the sky was vast, alive and watching. Perhaps the Anunnaki were never meant to be understood literally. Perhaps they were our ancestors' way of giving form to what they couldn't yet define: time, creation, and the strange intelligence behind it all. Because before we had science, before we had reason, we had stories. And through those stories, we made sense of the chaos. Every myth, every god, every symbol carved into clay was an act of faith, not in divine beings, but in meaning itself. The belief that there was an order to things, even if we couldn't see it. That need to find meaning hasn't left us. It's in our equations now, our telescopes, our endless search for origin stories in light and dust. In a way, modern science and ancient myth are both doing the same thing, trying to understand what came before the beginning. The only difference is the language we use. When we think of Sumer now, we think of ruins, half-sunken ziggurats, cracked tablets, museum glass. But once, this land was green, the rivers ran full, cities shone with temple fires, and people believed the gods walked among them. They lived by a rhythm written in the stars, planting, harvesting, worshipping, recording, all under the gaze of constellations they had named. And as the millennia passed, those stars stayed the same even as the people changed. Empires rose, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, and each borrowed from the one before. Languages evolved, stories blended, but the core idea endured, that we are part of something larger, something written above us. Even when the gods' names changed, their essence remained. They became angels, titans, spirits, symbols, the forms shifting, the meaning constant. That persistence is what gives myth its power. It's not about what's real, but what refuses to die. When we look back now and see the Anunnaki carved on ancient tablets, winged and radiant, it's easy to interpret them through our modern lens, as aliens, as metaphors, as messengers. But maybe the truth is simpler and somehow deeper. Maybe they were the embodiment of awe itself. The personification of the moment humanity first realized it could imagine gods, because that was the real miracle of Sumer, not their cities, not their mathematics, not even their writing. It was imagination. The ability to see something larger than themselves and call it divine, to look at the sky and say, that is where we come from. And even if we no longer call them Anunnaki, we still do the same thing every time we search the stars for life, every time we build stories about what might be out there. The farther back we dig, the more fragile our history becomes. Broken tablets, missing lines, eroded faces. The record fades until all that remains are symbols and guesses. But maybe that fragility is what makes it sacred, because what endures isn't the certainty, it's the curiosity. The endless need to keep asking, even when the answers dissolve like sand in wind. The Sumerians built their temples to reach the heavens. We build ours with telescopes and satellites, different towers, same longing. We may not call it worship anymore, but we still stand under the same stars, and we still wonder who might be watching. In the silence of the desert night, it's easy to imagine those ancient builders looking up just as we do, the same constellations, the same unending blackness. They didn't have telescopes or equations, but they had questions. And sometimes that's all it takes to build civilization, a shared question and the faith that the answer is out there. Maybe that's the real legacy of the Anunnaki. Not power, not divinity, but the act of searching itself. They were the mirror of human curiosity, gods created in our image of wonder. Their story still whispers through the sand because it was never about gods in the first place. It was about us. Thousands of years later, we still build monuments to meaning, books, art, music, machines that capture the faintest echo of starlight. And still we look back, we dig deeper, we translate, we reinterpret. Sometimes we get closer to truth, sometimes we drift further away. But always, we keep going, because mystery is the one resource that never runs out. The Anunnaki, the pyramids, the forgotten temples, they are not evidence of alien visitors or lost gods. They are evidence of something far more human, our refusal to stop seeking. The desert keeps its silence. It doesn't correct us when we get it wrong, and it doesn't confirm us when we get it right. It just waits, patient as eternity, holding its secrets under the sand. But if you stand there long enough in the quiet, you can almost hear it breathe, that low hum of time itself. The same wind that once swept through Uruk still moves the dunes tonight. And under that sky, you realize that the story never really ended. It's still being told in ruins, in stars, in us. Perhaps the Anunnaki were never gods or aliens, but the first reflection of something we've always known deep down, that to be human is to look for meaning in the dark, to imagine something larger than ourselves, and to keep imagining, even when it never answers back. As the stars turn above Mesopotamia, the old stories still whisper through the sand. They remind us that what we seek may not be out there at all. It may be within us, echoing through time. Because maybe to be remembered by heaven isn't about being divine, it's about being curious enough to ask. And that, in the end, is the greatest mystery of all.